loss of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hello and welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today's episode features an interview with Lourdes Ortega. Lourdes Ortega is a professor in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University. She's held previous faculty positions at Georgia State University, Northern Arizona University, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her main area of research is in second language acquisition, particularly socio-cognitive and educational dimensions in adult classroom settings. She has also long-standing interests in second language writing and foreign language education, and has published widely about systematic research synthesis and epistemological and ethical dimensions of second language acquisition research. She has been journal editor of Language Learning and has published widely in journals such as Annual Review of Applied Linguistics and the Journal of Second Language Writing. Her books include Understanding Second Language Acquisition and the Cambridge Handbook of Bilingualism. Matt spoke to Lourdes at the third Psychology of Language Learning Conference held here in Tokyo last year. Enjoy.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I'm sitting here with Lourdes Ortega, and we're at the Psychology on Language Learning Conference, I think, in Tokyo at Waseda University. So firstly, thanks a lot for your time today. It's very kind of you to give us your time. We usually begin our podcast by asking, could you introduce yourself, your professional background, and the type of work that you're involved in at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for having me. Well, I'm a professor in the United States at Georgetown University, and I work mostly with graduate students doing their doctorate in applied linguistics, language teaching, second language acquisition. And my work is, a large part of it is to mentor them to become researchers. And also I investigate topics that have to do with how adults learn new languages. I've done a lot of work within classrooms with adults, so college level types of learning of languages, especially Spanish oftentimes, but also English, and I speak German and modern Greek, but I tend not to work on those languages for whatever reason. And conversely, I do not speak Chinese or Japanese or Korean, but I do have a lot of doctoral students who end up doing dissertations using those languages. So it makes for a very interesting use of languages that I don't know or that I know in the research and the teaching.
I see, okay. And I believe you gave a plenary presentation yesterday at this conference. Fortunately, I wasn't able to attend, so perhaps for myself and for our listeners, could you give a brief summary of what you discussed during this talk?
Yes, so I have been talking and writing a lot about the need for the field of applied linguistics to broaden the perspective so that we think of language learning as becoming bilingual or multilingual speakers, even with adults. And so when I was asked to come to this conference for a plenary talk, I knew that the main areas of research in the conference are about motivation and affect, individual differences, mostly related to emotions and affects and identity and agency, and is the psychology of the language learner.
Okay.
And so I tried to then connect my own interests to the interests of the audience. So I decided in the end to talk about social justice and how we need to respond to how the world is becoming. Mm-hmm. It is becoming a very dangerous place for people who need to live with many languages, because there's a lot of bigotry, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments everywhere, And of course, there's also war, conflict, and movements of people. And people who learn foreign languages, so more elite types of language learners, also play a role in and have some room and space for addressing those kinds of currents in the world. So both, how do we connect our research to serving the kinds of language learning that are needed by many people in the world today who have to learn languages under a lot of pressure and a lot of neglect. But also, if we're teaching more elite types of language learning, how can we then also connect that language teaching to building on the elite's privilege to make them advocates of social justice as well, and to make them more aware of how our privilege, we oftentimes do not see it, and then we let a lot of oppression go on, and we cause a lot of oppression with our privilege. So I tried to connect the psychology of the language learner with social justice, and I included a lot of examples because I know that examples are very important for teachers and for researchers to be able to envision a way of doing research that is different from what they have been doing.
Yeah, and just very briefly on that topic, I think as a teacher working in Japan, I guess Japan is a very privileged place, and perhaps there are some English learners in the world that aren't as privileged as perhaps Japanese learners of English. How can we, as somebody who teaches in this context, could you tell me something about the not so socially privileged learners in the world,
right.
perhaps?
Well, why don't I turn around your question a little bit? I think maybe I can talk about within Japan.
Sure, yeah.
Strands of privilege and oppression that I see related to language learning and teaching. I always feel that teaching EFL in Japan is true that EFL is, a lingua franca is thought of as the language of power, the language of commerce, the language of privilege. And so also we think of Japan as a very wealthy country with a very high quality of life. So all of that, yes, is privilege. But think about, for example, how many Japanese speakers of English get looked upon unfavorably for their English, right? And certainly never receive any praise for being speakers of English. Whereas think about how many white people who live in Japan and learn Japanese are adored, admired, and praised for their ability to speak Japanese. But if you think about it, it's English and Japanese, it's the same pair of languages, the same distance, the same difficulty in learning it, right? But if a Japanese person speaks English, will never get any admiration for it. And often will get actually evaluated negatively, like, oh yeah, but their English is not so good yet. But if it's the person who has learned Japanese from an English background, then they get all kinds of praise and support and self-affirmation out of it, right? So that's a form of oppression going both ways, or privilege in one and oppression in the other. So that happens within Japan, and that can be addressed through teaching. And it obviously is important for learners of English to feel that they're doing something really well and important, and that they deserve praise. And that if they don't get praise and they get negative reactions, that's on the other person, not on them.
Yeah.
So that's what we call microaggressions also, small little things, very subtle, that happen constantly to people. And sometimes they don't even know, why do I feel so icky about it, right?
Yeah.
They cannot put the finger on what's happening that is making them feel bad. Yeah. So teachers can work with learners to help them identify those events, and to analyze them in ways that reject the assumption of, I'm a deficit speaker of English. I will never be able to speak English well. So that's one part within Japan. Another part is very many people, including many Japanese people, think that Japan is a very monolingual country and very homogeneous in terms of language and culture. And yet there are, I think it's about 1.7% of the population are immigrants and refugees, not refugees probably, but just immigrants. And so in our teaching of English or Japanese or whatever, to make this linguistic diversity within Japan visible Every time multilingualism is invisible to people, we are harming those people who just walk in life invisibly multilingual.
Yeah.
So within Japan, there is a large group of about 800,000 people, I think, who are of Korean origin. And there are many contradictory, paradoxical currents. So some people are learning Korean in Japan for the love of the soap operas, I think it is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that group of people who live in Japan who are of Korean origin are quite stigmatized within Japan. And so these two things coexist. And they're many times they're not put together in the minds even of the people in Japan who learn Korean out of the love for the soap operas. Right? They may not be seeing, it may be totally invisible that there are also people within within Japan who are speakers of Korean and they belong to an ethnic minority and they feel like they are a minority. And there are about 60 schools in Japan serving Korean origin students. And so, again, not very many people speak about that or know that. So making that visible, for example, in our teaching. We tend to include a lot of social issues in our teaching, but they often come from UK, US, Canada, whatever. Why not also look for diversity and social justice topics within the national context?
I read some papers quite a few years ago about linguistic diversity within Japanese, the language Japanese, and for example, the Okinawan language has been marginalized, and there are also kind of pockets of areas around Japan where there's like kind of Creoles being spoken, and the awareness amongst Japanese people is very low about this. So I guess it's that point too.
Yeah. So that's an excellent point. I think probably a lot of teachers right now are already doing some sociolinguistic awareness of English in their teaching. Like, they try to teach that there are different varieties of English, that English lingua franca can draw on any of those varieties, that we don't need to privilege UK English over US English or native English of some variety over non-native English varieties. But then why not also include the fact that Japanese has a number of different language varieties and dialects and other languages that are indigenous and coexist with Japanese. And again, it's a way of making English less special, thinking my own language is just Japanese, the standard Japanese, right? And English has all this richness, variety, and diversity, sociolinguistic diversity, but making it more equal. Every language has sociolinguistic diversity, and there are language hierarchies, both within English, within Japanese, and then obviously a language hierarchy in English and all the other languages like Japanese.
If I may, I'd like to change the topic drastically, actually, to the topic that I'd like to ask you about, if that's okay. And I'd like to base the majority of this interview on the ongoing divide or struggle between language teachers and SLA researchers. And I'm hesitant to use that as a divide, but that is kind of how they're often described or set apart from each other. And I kind of talked about this briefly with Simon Borg in a previous interview that we did. But just to begin, can you set the scene of this relationship or lack of relationship, perhaps?
I think there is a relationship, and that's why there are tensions. When if two groups don't have any interest in each other, then there won't be any tensions. So I think that teachers do want to know about research and to talk to researchers. Perhaps not all teachers, but many teachers. And I think that researchers want to talk to teachers and know from teachers and about teachers. And again, not all researchers, but perhaps many. And that's how I think why the tensions arise, because we do have different goals and different roles. There's also a hierarchy, so research tends to be seen as superior, whatever, I don't know why, but with more value in society, I don't know. But of course, within applied linguistics and second language acquisition, a lot of researchers focus on researching teachers and students and teaching and classrooms, right? So in a way, I think it depends on the researcher and how they conceive of their own research program. If they take it that I have a superior expertise, and so I'm going to investigate teaching and teachers and students and classrooms, but I'm going to do it from the position of power, I know better, and you don't have any say in what I'm asking in my study, in how I'm doing my study, and how I report back to you after I do the study. That would be a very poor kind of researcher attitude, and I would like to think that fewer and fewer researchers do that, although I think implicitly and unconsciously many researchers may have that attitude, unfortunately. So I've always been convinced that research about teaching can be helpful if it's done when the researcher puts themselves in the shoes of the teacher. But if they're not able to do that, I don't think they can produce very good research. And another problem, I think, is that for a long time in applied linguistics, a lot of the research was exclusively quantitative. And so that meant counting things out of context. And teaching is everything about the context. So that created, I think, a gap between the knowledge that was produced in the studies and then the usefulness of that for teaching. Because error correction is a very good example that I use a lot. Correcting errors. When a teacher is doing error correction in the classroom, they're doing it based on their knowledge of the students, on the moment, the interpretation of what's happening right now in this moment. But when the researcher is counting occurrences of error correction, they're just absolutely extracting, just the mechanical error correction, extracting it completely out of what the teacher was doing and why, and what the relationship is between that student and that teacher at that moment of an error arising. So then for me, there is a huge disconnect. And so, unfortunately, sometimes teachers also do have a blind faith in research, right? So they also sometimes just read the studies on error correction and love them and think that they can use recasts all the time, or they can use explicit correction all the time, or whatever it is. So for me, the most important thing is not to lose sight of contextualizing both the teaching and the research, and being very critical. Not every piece of research is useful, and certainly not useful in all contexts. So I think that we need a lot more humility from researchers, but perhaps also a lot more critical stance from teachers about research and the value of research.
So I was going to ask, how can we make sure that we, as teachers, I guess, handle research with caution and not to overgeneralize things? Right. And
Well, some teachers, I think teachers draw a lot from talking to other teachers, going to professional meetings, engaging in teaching each other about their own teaching, sharing ideas. Visiting other classrooms is super, super useful to see how other people teach, because then you learn a lot about how you teach. So I think that the more a teacher engages in these kinds of activities that are professional activities with other peers, the more they develop the capacity when they go to research to take it with a grain of salt, or to be properly concerned with contextualizing and deciding and judging whether they're going to find anything useful or not in that research.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. In your plenary, your TEFL plenary, I believe it was called, it answered one big question, or attempted to look at the question, what is SLA research good for anyway? And in this plenary, you talked of a set of points that were set out in TEFL's action agenda that I believe was published recently.
Yeah.
One of the goals listed was to make research more inclusive and diverse. So what I'm wondering is what boundaries are currently in place that would restrict this or limit this inclusivity and diversity?
That's a great question. Thank you for it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm not sure what I'm not sure what I want to find out, but that's...
The action agenda put forth by TEFL, I was involved in the work to craft this agenda. Okay. And it was like 2 years of a very, very intense group work. It was 8 of us. And so we really agonized over every theme, every conclusion, and every priority that we put forth in the end. This was very important as a priority. So making research and inquiry more inclusive in the profession. What we had in mind was exactly what we talked about just in this previous question, making the connections between teaching and research and teachers and researchers more fluid, not just by, for example, translating better the research so that teachers can read it and understand it, but by making a lot of teacher research or teacher inquiry as valuable for the profession and for the public as the researchers' research. So raising the value of teacher-generated inquiry and knowledge and research, and being more inclusive also of different paradigms and different ways of doing research, so more qualitative, more autobiographical, more based on analysis of artifacts, narratives. There is an initiative that has been going on by Harry Kucha and Richard Smith. So they have explored the possibility of teacher associations creating a research agenda out of brainstorming from association members. What do you want to investigate? What do you want to be answered? What are the big questions that you have in your daily teaching that you would like to have some more strategies for or more knowledge about? And then they actually established a whole research agenda with a lot of different questions, and then different teachers in the association took up different parts, and then they meet together and they report on what they found. So it's a version, I think, as I understand it, of action research and teacher research, but it's absolutely entirely generated grassroots. It's not like teachers who are doing a master's program and therefore they do their own classroom, they do some research in their classroom, and because that is much less sustainable. So being inclusive in what counts as research, whose research counts as research, and then being creative, thinking outside the box for other ways of generating knowledge about English language teaching and language teaching in general, that is not just the very straight traditional notion of top-down research.
I think I've read some of Richard Smith's work where I forgot the name of it, but like exploratory teacher research, I think that's the term or something. Well, and the idea is to make the research more public and more accessible and maybe not written, maybe presented as a poster instead. That seems like a very good direction to take things in. Thinking back to what we talked about at the beginning of the interview with social injustice and maybe some linguistic problems that arise, are there any kind of trends in our field that limit certain scholars from getting their work more widely read, for example?
I think there could be a lot of improvements with the transparency and clarity with which we write, and our ability to write for different audiences. I think it's also very, very complicated to write about language teaching and learning. There are so many paradoxes in multilingualism that sometimes it's really difficult to get at a straight story that is accurate and yet a little bit simple, a little bit like people can use it and understand it. Because we researchers, we tend to hedge and say, yes, this, but that, and the other hand, I qualify and these caveats. And once we start like that, yes, we're producing very nuanced kinds of dissemination of findings. But at the same time, we're just kind of like making it so complicated that it's difficult to relate to the public. I've been thinking lately that maybe in graduate programs where we train teachers and researchers, we should add a course on dissemination, advocacy, communication, public communication, and maybe that would allow us to take it more seriously and to build the strategies, because it's not easy for any of us to know how to communicate with that wider audiences or the public.
Yeah. I think I saw the term interface used by, I think it was Amos Paran in a recent article, and he talked about the need to keep an interface between, I guess, teachers and researchers, if you like. What ways can we really keep an interface? Like what areas or by what means can we maintain an interface between research and practice, I guess?
Yeah, research and practice. Probably we can think about it spatially.
Spatially, okay.
Yeah. So if teachers are in schools and researchers do not go into the schools, right, the interface is going to be difficult. And if researchers are in universities or in conferences and teachers don't go to those spaces, then the interface is going to be difficult. So maybe we could also be very conscious and self-aware of how many spaces we transverse or not, how often we go into other people's spaces or not. And if we observe that we're usually going only to certain spaces and only with peers, so teacher spaces for teachers, researcher spaces for researchers, maybe then that's a clue that we can make an extra effort to find ways to travel to these other spaces that we are never a part of. Maybe that's a way to create an interface.
And speaking of this kind of spatial idea, often papers and presentations are very one-way. And do you see any value in having kind of bi-directional kind of interactions, like actual interactions between people in our field, for example?
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, I think that would be a really good initiative. Yeah, to implement. I've noticed if I visit a school or I visit a group of teachers and I do not present, but I just let them ask questions, then there is a wonderful dialogue. And I learn a lot from them and they learn from me. If I present, sometimes if I'm lucky, I will inspire some people in the audience to maybe try out something in their teaching. And if we are lucky, we have question-answer time and some interaction may arise that is interesting. But when there is less teacher-fronted, researcher-fronted presentation, and a little bit more just conversation, I think that a lot of things can come out of that are very good.
I see. Maybe just one final question. Trying to tie everything together, I've written a question about like moral responsibility, and thinking about our first topic we talked about and this topic, do you think that we as professionals have a moral responsibility to, as teachers, be a bit more linguistically aware of what's going on in the world? And do you think that researchers also have a responsibility to make sure their research gets the message across as well?
Completely.
Okay.
Yes to both. I agree very much. Yes.
Yeah. And you talked about a judgment call in your plenary. So how can we go about judging and making these calls, I guess?
Well, for all of us, judging is about discerning. And so I think that's critical thinking that builds up over many years of being very self-reflective. So both teachers and researchers, we need that very much. And our students need it too. So it's also part of what we should be teaching to our students.
I see. Yeah. So there seems to be a kind of a synergy between all of these things.
Yeah, I definitely, I never feel the tension. I know that the tension is out there, but I don't feel it. I know that many colleagues feel it, and I know many teachers feel it. I've never felt it. I've always felt very comfortable thinking about teaching, talking to teachers, and talking to researchers, and feeling like I can be in those roles with comfort.
Yeah, I see. Okay, well, I think that's a nice word to end on, comfort. Thank you, Lourdes, for speaking to me today.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me in your podcast.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that interview with Professor Lourdes Ortega. We would like to thank Lourdes once again for sitting down and talking with us. We are always happy to connect with our listeners. We have a Facebook page. We are on Twitter at TEFLology. And we have an email address, teflology@gmail.com. We also have a website, TEFLology-podcast.com, where you can go and find all of our previous episodes. So we'll be back soon with an all-new regular episode. Thank you for listening.